Mukam karoti vachalam pangum langhayate girim yatkravatamaham mande paramananda madhavam. My salutations to that supremely blissful Madhava, by whose grace the dumb become eloquent and the lame cross mountains. Good morning, everyone. That was a lovely presentation. We had a nice addition with a deep male voice. So it was good, huh? Everyone enjoyed it. This Thursday will be Janmashtami, the traditional birthday of Sri Krishna. So I thought I would speak about a little bit about his life, but mostly about his message, which we get from Bhagavad Gita. I won't say too much about his life because you probably all know a lot more than I do about it. I'm not so well versed in all this Puranic and Itihasic literature and everything. And nowadays everybody watches all of these movies, the Bhagavata and Mahabharata and everything. So people know about it, but the fascinating thing to me is how different phases of the life of Sri Krishna represent almost a different character, a different type of worship, how different parts of India worship Krishna differently. So we get these different bhavas, different ways of worship. When he's a child, the Vatsalya bhava, when he gets older, and different names will be given, Gopala, Govinda, and then he'll be the cowherd boy, and then he'll move to Vrindavan and put on his turban and be a big shot, a king, and everyone will worship him that way. Then he'll move all the way to the west side of India, when it'll be Krishna and Rukmini, and Rukmini won't mean too much to people who only like this Radha Krishna. So it's fascinating. I don't think there's any other religious personality, we can say, that's worshipped in so many different ways, at different stages of life, in different parts of India, with the different scriptures also. Some from this Itihasa, Mahabharata, this Gita period, others from the Puranas, with the Bhagavata mostly. So it's really fascinating. So I thought I would say just a little bit about the birth of Sri Krishna and how he grew up and everything. We all know the story that it was predicted that in fact he heard comes to heard a voice saying that his sister would give birth to the future person who would be his destroyer, eighth child. So they put Devaki in jail and Vasudeva, her husband, in prison also, and comes and killed all the first 7 children. It's a terrible story, not knowing which exactly. Then the 8th was born, and when he slayed the 8th, then it turned out that it was the Divine Mother. They had switched ahead of time, and so he grew up with his foster parents, we can say. And so it's fascinating, the story. And the Mathura, so the first stage will be in Mathura. And then he'll be raised by Yashoda. So now this attitude of Vatsalya Bhava becomes the most important way of worshipping Krishna. That as a small, helpless infant, and the main specialty of this type of worship is that God becomes very small and we become very big. We're not depending on God, God is depending on us. It's a very sweet reversal relationship. And it's very, very important in the whole tradition of worshiping Krishna this way. As the small child, the mother doesn't expect anything in return, maybe in the future, but at that time, child can't even say thank you. Just can't even really love back at that age, such a small infant. And then he gets a little older and he plays a lot of tricks, very mischievous and everything. So, and we have all of these recorded in the Bhagavata Purana, which becomes tremendously important. So this phase, of course, is one that's very dear to many, many devotees. And Sri Ramakrishna, he didn't follow this type of worship exactly, but almost the parallel thing with the baby Rama. And it's a little bit curious how this was one of the types of worship when Thakur practiced all of the bhavas. This was the one a little bit untraditional. Normally, this is practiced feeling ourselves to be like Mother Yashoda, taking care of the small infant, the Gopala. But Thakur did the same thing because the Guru showed up, Jatadhari, with that baby Ramlala. So, and then when Sri Krishna gets older, we get this ideal of the Sakya Bhava. When he's in the meadow and grazing the cows and all the other boys are there and they're close, intimate friends, they jump on each other, they'll eat off the same plate. A very fascinating idea that anyone can have that relationship with God. Right? But it takes away that grandeur and that distance and that fear. This idea of the Sakya Bhava is really a fascinating thing. I've mentioned this once before, or actually more than once, but when Swami Vivekananda came back from the West, one time he was doing worship. He told his brother monks, "Let me do worship today." And at the time of the food offering, everybody left the room, this shrine room, which was traditional in those days, but they heard Swamiji say, "Come, my friend, and sit down." So Swamiji had that relationship, other relationships also. It's nothing exclusive with this. But he could look upon Sri Ramakrishna that way as his friend. Most of the time, of course, it was a Dasya Bhava that he looked upon him. He felt he was the servant of Sri Ramakrishna. He was his Hanuman that way. But this shows that different phase of life, a different way of worship and everything. And then he has to go off to become the king in Mathura. So again, going back, but the most important phase of his life, we can say, was as the friend of Arjuna. And this Dasya Bhava, usually we think of the relationship between Hanuman and Sri Rama. But this is also practiced that way. We learn this perfect attitude, the servant to the master, with Sri Krishna and Arjuna. So he becomes the charioteer. Now all of this is from the Mahabharata and Gita. And the earlier phase from the Puranas, that's as if it's a different person almost. And not that there's a disconnect, but almost. And then when he goes west, he goes out to Dwaraka and everything. I know almost nothing about that phase of life, but this is his final chapter, and he takes Rukmini as his queen and everything. So people from that side of India, that'll be the most important thing. And other places, it has to be Radha Krishna. Then we can go to Puri, and it'll be Sri Krishna with the Subhadra and Balarama. So it's really fascinating that one figure can be worshipped in so many different ways with different scriptures in different parts of India and be beloved by everybody throughout India, every part of India, but they'll worship him in such different ways, almost as if it's a different character. That those who worship him as Rukmini, they won't think of the child Krishna as much to that extent. But the one aspect that is more or less universally accepted is Sri Krishna as the expounder of the teachings of Bhagavad Gita, and the part that he plays in the Mahabharata and the Kurukshetra war, and this is the theme of the Mahabharata, and this is the reason that we're given for the birth of Sri Krishna and why he's considered an avatar. That the whole question of dharma and righteousness, and that we know that whole story. So that's more or less what I would like to focus on today. The message of the Bhagavad Gita. This Gita, of course, is studied so much. Generally, we do it verse by verse, chapter by chapter. But I want to do kind of an overview and look at some of the main themes, and especially some of the important contributions, because we often hear that the Bhagavad Gita represents the essence of the teachings of the Upanishads. Even Shankaracharya, he'll mention that in his introduction to his commentary on Gita, which is true. But so many new things come in. and important contributions come in, and there's a very independent and almost radical streak to the Bhagavad Gita with regard to some of the orthodox traditions of the earlier Upanishadic period. So I want to just kind of touch on some of these different ideas and go through beginning to end, because there's a transition that takes place. That some of the teachings we find in the very beginning of the Gita turn out to be just leading Arjuna to the final teaching, that's final message that we'll get of renouncing all dharmas and taking refuge, the Sharanagati that will come at the very end. So very fascinating how there's kind of a element of a Socratic dialogue. You know this dialogues of Socrates, that by starting out with some easy assumptions and asking questions, he leads the disciple to discover the truth on his own with a series of questions and changes of attitude and leading to some higher and higher ideal. We have this Nyaya. There are different Nyayas in the literature tradition of Sanskrit tradition. One is called Arundhati Nyaya, where we're led to a very subtle truth through an obvious truth, or something that seems obvious. And this Nyaya is based on this idea that at the time of marriage, that the husband, prospective husband, groom, will have to show the bride this little star, Arundhati. So they say that he'll go outside and point to something that, because you can't just say, oh, look at that little star. The eye won't go to it. So we'll say, look at this branch of the tree. You see that? Yes. And go a little higher. You see one big star there? Yes. You see the two stars to the left? Yes. That little one right above it, that's Arundhati. And this is the way it's explained sometimes, the teachings of Gita, how we start with some very basic ideas, and it gets more and more subtle till we get to that very final teaching. So we know the setting of the Gita. For some people is very important, for some people is very secondary, that this battle is going on, and Arjuna is the main warrior, and with a lot of bravado, he says, let me go and see. Sri Krishna is his charioteer. Let's go see these fools who want to fight with me. That he feels that adrenaline, so he wants to go and see. And somehow he forgets, or he doesn't realize, or it doesn't strike him that these will be all of his relatives, his cousins and grandfathers and everything. So he gets cold feet, or he gets faint-hearted, or he gets too much compassion. We can take it in any different way, but he doesn't want to fight. And this is the main device, literary device, that how can Sri Krishna convince Arjuna to take part in this battle. And then by the time we get to chapter 11, we find this very interesting statement that has already been done. You really have no choice in all of this, but this is part of this Leela that play. I'm going to try to convince you, and you're going to have to agree and everything, but don't worry that you're going to end up doing it, that this is a done deal. Your nature will make you do it, and also I was born for this purpose, and this is part of that Leela. It's almost a scripted play at this point. So all of these different ideas at the very beginning, trying to convince him to fight, and then letting him know that you're going to fight anyhow, that you'll make the decision. I know it, because it's already pre-approved, something like that. So the question comes up for a lot of people, are some of the teachings just to get Arjuna to fight in the battle? Because we'll get some arguments. Some of them will be very high things about the real nature of the self, the jnana yoga, and who is killing whom, all of these ideas. Some will be a little bit silly, we think, that if you don't fight, they'll make fun of you. We don't take that to be such a great argument, but is it just, are these things just because it's in the setting of the war, or is the setting of the war for a different purpose? I like to think that the duty of the Kshatriya to fight in battle and kill people is an example of dharma at its worst. That if this is the example of somebody performing duty, even when it's distasteful, then for the rest of us it'll be easy. None of us will have to face, unless we're in the military or something like that, such daunting type of dharma. So this is one way of looking at the whole thing. Then there will be even some people who say, no, don't think it literally that he's trying to kill people. It's all allegorical. This battle is the battle within, and it's our own enemies, they're our own inner demons and everything. In any event, we can really divorce it from this, to a certain extent, divorce it from the setting of the Mahabharata and just take these teachings as they stand on their own. And there are many people, scholars, who will say that this was an add-on, that this wasn't originally part of Mahabharata because it's so distinct and so separate that it was written at some time and attached to the Mahabharata like that. It doesn't matter to us. We're not scholars that way. But it's nice to be able to look at this in Gita in its context and to understand these arguments. Many of the arguments can be traced back to trying to convince Arjuna. I have this conviction that some of these teachings are for that purpose almost entirely. When we get to these verses that say that your nature is going to make you do it, that we're not given much scope for change at that time. We wonder, nigraha kim karishyati, how much scope is there for self-control and changing ourselves and everything? Why is he telling Arjuna that, look, everybody has to follow their own nature, you can't get out of this war? Is it just for that, or is this the final truth? Because otherwise we're told that we can change, we have to learn to change and everything. So we'll get a little tension back and forth. Some of the things we can say that, yes, Sri Krishna is trying to convince him. Other things we'll say, this is absolutely universally true. Most of it is a little combination. And as I say, it's a literary device. This question, I'm getting a little off the track here, but this question of how much can we change our nature, our swabhava, is a fascinating question. And Sri Ramakrishna, he seems to have this conviction that there are certain elements in one's swabhava, in one's real nature, that won't change. And these will be with regard to if one is devotional in nature, one is more suited to the path of jnana yoga or karma yoga or bhakti yoga, and anything like that we won't be able to change too much. Swami Vivekananda says, take the path of least resistance. That way everything else we can change. So in the Gita, the real argument is not with regard to our nature, it's with regard to the nature of the individual within the caste system, which is another interesting thing. But the caste system is not because of the caste, because one's swabhava is like that, one is born to be a warrior. Anyhow, we'll find all of these different types of very interesting psychological questions about how much we can change and the nature of the self, what inherent characteristics and qualities do we have that we shouldn't try to change, that we should utilize, and which ones we can take as, oh, these are just some old samskaras that are not helpful and I want to change them completely, eradicate them. And we can. Some things we can. So there's a very nice distinction there, which I won't go into anymore. That was just a little side thing. Okay. So the status of the Gita is that next to the Upanishads, that this has the highest authority. We have this doctrine that Shruti takes precedence over everything else. This belongs to Smriti. But the Gita is raised almost to the level of an Upanishad. At the end of each chapter, it's actually referred to as an Upanishad. And very rarely will we find anything that will contradict anything that's in the Upanishads. But as I was saying, that we'll find many new contributions. One is a fully developed concept of personal God. In the Upanishads, we'll get some type of allegorical ideas that Brahman is sitting around thinking this or that, but philosophically speaking, there's no personal God in the sense of the Bhagavan that comes in the Puranas and comes in Gita. In Gita, of course, in the form of Sri Krishna. But the Saguna Brahman of the Upanishads is not the kind, loving, sweet God listening to our prayers, granting our prayers. It'll be the Ishvara with his power to project the universe and uphold the universe and enter into the universe. Although it's still not exactly the personal God. So this is a great contribution, and probably this represents a very old tradition. I remember one of my professors, he used to say that side by side with the Upanishadic tradition, there was something called the Bhagavata tradition. And it's not very well known. It's not our Bhagavata Purana. Bhagavata Purana, as we know it today, is a very late text. And the scholars argue about these things all of the time, but we know that Ramanuja, Madhva, that they don't even quote from it. So there's a good indication it's very late. But all of the stories and everything will be very, very old. And if we take the incidents to be real, it'll be very, very old. So Indian scholars will say it's 5,000 years old. The Western scholars will say it's, 12th century, something like that. Doesn't matter. But the point is that there was probably a very lively tradition that was followed, religious tradition followed by the majority of people during that time, because the Upanishadic traditions were meant for the Dvijas, for the Brahmanas, really. They were the only ones who had access to the Sanskrit learning and could study these things. This is that adhikaravada, this restrictive type of idea. So the theory is that this Gita and other texts like that, Mahabharata, that they were composed specifically for everybody else, so that everyone would have access, so no one could be denied. And this denial of the study of the Upanishads and hearing the Mahavakyas, that wasn't simply denying them this opportunity to have some type of education or something, it was denying them the opportunity to get liberation, because moksha was tied in to this idea of hearing this Tattvamasi and everything. This is the orthodox view, of course. The very orthodox view, you'll have to be born again in the Brahmin caste as a male. So it was highly exclusive, and Swamiji himself couldn't stand that, and Buddha himself probably was the one who helped bring an end to a lot of these things. And this Gita is probably around the same period. It's very hard to date these things, but at the time of Buddha, and the Gita is also highly responsible for breaking down that, we could say, prejudice, or this high-class, male-oriented type of spiritual ideology. It's strange how the Upanishads are so brilliant and so universal and everything, and the way it was practiced at that time, with this heavy emphasis on caste and everything, how exclusive it was. But the Gita breaks it all down. That's why I say there's something radical about it. It breaks it down. It's open to everybody. So we get this, I have a verse here. I'll read this verse, it's a nice verse. It says, Stri Shudra Dvija Bandhunam Trai Na Shruti Gochara Karma Shreyasi Mudhanam Shreya Evam Bhavedya Iti Bharatam Akhyanam Kripaya Munina Kuritam. The Mahabharata was composed by the compassionate sage Vyasa for the welfare of those who are deluded regarding the path to salvation. These are all the people who didn't get the spiritual teachings, not that they were fools or anything. Since they are not permitted access to the Vedas, namely women, Shudras, and those twice born who have fallen from the path. So this was a very strong traditional idea that this itihasa means Mahabharata and Ramayana mostly, and the Puranas, that these were composed for everybody. So this is an everyman type of
philosophy, nothing exclusive about it. So this, the first contribution that I mentioned is this idea of the personal God. Then we have the theory of the avatar. This avatar becomes almost again universally accepted in the religious traditions of India. It's hard for us to imagine that this is an idea that we don't find in any prominent way in the Upanishads. Swami Vivekananda has a theory that all of these things, we can find traces of these things in the early scriptures and everything. But this full-blown theory of the avatar and this idea of dharma and coming in every age when there's a need, this is a great contribution that the Gita makes. Now, we shouldn't think, if there are things not in the Upanishads, but there are things in Gita, that the things in the Gita have to be wrong, because the Upanishads, that's the Shruti that takes the precedence. Another great statement of Swami Vivekananda. He said that spiritual truths are eternal, but they're discovered in time. And there may be more and more spiritual truths that we discover. So all of these things that we're getting in Gita are contributions, but it doesn't mean that they, if they're not in the Upanishads, that we can't accept them with the same type of validity as the others. And as I said before, these were things probably that the common people accepted. And the Upanishads just represented a different type of tradition of that Jnana Yoga. So, first developed theory, we can say, of the avatar. Then we'll get a lot of Sankhya and Yoga, and aside from this Bhagavata tradition, that will be added to the Gita, all of the ideas of the three gunas, which become very important, the cosmology, all of the Purusha, Prakriti elements, these are all are part of this syncretic element of the Gita, how it could take all different ideas from different traditions and bring them together, when previously one would fight with the other. You can't just accept some of this. The pundits and the scholars, they would argue against the tradition was a little bit different. They would say, no, you can't accept it. So the Gita, it really accepts everything. I sometimes feel that the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna are so close to the Gita, how he accepted all different paths. We'll find that there. There was a very interesting statement that was made by Swami Parameshanandaji. He said that there's a beautiful Bengali translation, not commentary, I think. He said translation of the Gita. They said, oh, what is that, Swamiji? He said, Kotamrita. The teachings of Sri Ramakrishna really embody all of these ideas, that all the different paths and the different ways of approaching God and accepting everything. So he felt that these two were almost companions. And many, of course, in our order will say, if you study anything, that study Gita and study the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, Kotamrita. So this opening up of everything is part of the radical nature of the Gita. Women were not considered qualified in this Orthodox tradition to study these things. Non-Brahmins were not considered qualified. So here we're getting not only do they have access to everything, but liberation is open to everyone. There's no distinction that way. So this is why Swamiji loved his Gita so much, that he really made no distinction, God dwelling equally within all the beings, no distinction between male or female or anything like that. It was one of the great, not just teachings of Swamiji, but that's how he lived his life. And remember, Swamiji was a Kshatriya. So the Gita has a very strong Kshatriya tradition and slight anti-Brahmin tradition. And Swamiji also had that a little bit. that he used to like to say, you look at the Upanishads, who were the real teachers of the Upanishads? Janaka and the kings and everything, yeah. So this Gita represents the householder side and also a little bit of the non-Brahmin side of things, and this Kshatriya power, that strength, because it's all about these warriors. So that comes through also. Then this power struggle between the householder and the sannyasin. This is also a big theme, and it was not only was liberation supposed to be only for males and Brahmins, but sannyasins, they had to renounce everything. So there's tremendous bias towards the sannyasin that we'll find in the Orthodox tradition. And in Gita, we get a complete reversal, that who is a real sannyasin? There's a beautiful verse in the first verse of chapter 6. Who is the real sannyasin? Not somebody who just puts on this cloth and gives up some duties, household duties. Real sannyasins, whoever can perform duties without any attachment, can mentally renounce. That'll be the most important. That's the real sannyasi. So the householder who does that is the real sannyasin. The sannyasi who's attached is not a real sannyasin. So we get almost a kind of redefinition of terms in Gita. So the sannyasin doesn't mean there's a formal sannyasa. It'll mean whoever can really be free from attachment. That's the real sannyasin. Then yajna. This whole interpretation of yajna as a symbol of doing everything as an offering. This is another very nice element in Gita. No longer are we talking about yajna as the actual formal type of ritual with the fire and offerings and all of that. Now it becomes purely symbolic. So everything has to be done as a yajna. Everything has to be done with the same idea that it's an offering. Even the taking of food. This is what we chant with our Brahmarpanam. Even the taking food is a type of yajna. It's symbolically, we're offering everything into that fire within. Everything we do, everything we listen to some music, beautiful music, is an offering coming through the ears to that indweller who can listen to it. We decide not to listen to music. We practice control. That's also done as an offering. So the very nice reinterpretation of ideas and terms that we get. So one of these, again, is with this yajna. And then we'll get to the 4 yogas. So this will be a great contribution. Whether we really want to say these are 4, we talk about the 4 yogas. Swamiji popularized that idea. He really popularized that idea. But the Gita, every chapter is considered a yoga. But we can really see these 4 different strains. And there's emphasis on the path of knowledge, and the Jnana Yoga, and path of action, Karma Yoga. And then Bhakti and Raja Yoga, they'll all be there. The Raja Yoga, if we want to say meditation of the Upanishads, was a different type of thing. It was more contemplation with this manana, the Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. We have to hear the scriptures, then we think deeply about it, we meditate on them, and the truth will flash. In the Gita, it's more the Patanjali type of yoga. Not that we don't have the other idea, but it's more controlling the mind, controlling the thoughts and everything. So that'll be there. And when we get to Karma Yoga, then now we'll get another little switch, not completely, but a little bit. In the whole Shruti tradition, the Karma Kanda comes first. We do rituals and everything, and then we get later to the Jnana Kanda. Then that's the time when we're either vanaprasthins, living in the forest, or we've renounced everything as sannyasins, and now the Upanishads will be the main text for that. So, Karma Yoga was considered to be something subsidiary, and it wasn't thought to be the selfless type of action. It was more ritual. And it's interesting, whenever we see Sri Ramakrishna talking about Karma Yoga and not recommending it so much, he's talking more about ritualistic worship, generally, not always, of course. And when he talks about, say, someone like Vidyasagar, He said that type of work that he does out of compassion is also very sattvic. It's good work and everything. But he didn't want people to do too much of ritual, and that was always connected with this idea of karma. So we'll get this teaching. One of the very important verses in Gita is that one can realize God through karma alone. Karma neva. So we know the verse that Janaka and others, they were able to do that. So this becomes a very important contribution. In fact, karma yoga, we can say that the Gita, if it emphasizes anything, it's karma yoga. Performance of duty done in a perfectly unattached type of way, of spirit, that it can also lead us to the highest type of realization. The Jnana Yoga we find at the very beginning of Gita. And by Jnana Yoga, now we're talking about what is the real nature of the self. And this, all of these things have a double purpose. Why is he giving this teaching to Arjuna? That the self is not born and it doesn't die, so that he won't think he's killing people. Now we can say that, well, we're really using a very high philosophical idea for some very practical purpose. Well, it's true, it's okay. But the teaching itself stands on its own, that the real nature of the self, and this is the very beginning of Gita because everything is based on this idea. It's Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga. It's all based on this idea that divinity dwells within us, that we're not just this material combination of elements and everything. That we have to have that idea at the very beginning, that the self is unborn, it doesn't die, there can be an eternal relationship with God, God dwells within. So the Jnana Yoga comes at the very beginning, and we'll find that when Sri Krishna explains these things, that he'll always give an illustration and an example. This is another nice element of the Gita, that in chapter 2 we'll have our Sthita Prajna section. So we'll see what is somebody like who has realized the self, has this steady wisdom established in Savanti. So we'll get that in chapter 12, who is the real bhakta. And bhakti yoga, and the Gita is not our traditional bhakti yoga, singing and dancing. So the real bhakta, he'll have all the qualities of the Sthita Prajna. He'll be calm and quiet and see no ups and downs, see the divinity everywhere. A very beautiful type of description. And then when we get to the three gunas, chapter 14, then he'll also give the example. Because Arjuna keeps asking, what are these people like? So what is the person like who transcended the three gunas? So we get a beautiful description. And we find they're all the same. So the person who's transcended the three gunas, the person who's the ideal bhakta, the person established in Savanti, they all have the same qualities. And this emphasis in Gita is always on this being on an even keel. The mind, no big ups and downs, and seeing that divinity everywhere, feeling that oneness everywhere. It's not this ecstatic type of love that we'll get in some of the bhakti scriptures. Not that it denies it, but this is just a different type of emphasis. And when we get to Karma Yoga, that we find that, again, there's big variety, different ways we practice this Karma Yoga. That as devotees, we do it one way, that everything is an offering. And these mesh so nicely with Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. That what does he say? That Jnana Yoga will tell us that this ego is something insubstantial. We analyze and it disappears. We don't find it, but then it comes back. So he says, utilize that. So we have some sense of I, then we do everything as an offering. Yeah, somebody will say, oh, you have the feeling that you're acting. I say, yes, of course I do. I'm not going to lie. If I cook a meal, and I say, no, I didn't cook the meal. God did it through me. It sounds silly. But I can say that while I'm cooking it, I feel that I'm doing it as an offering. I'm trying to do it without any attachment, not caring for praise or blame, anything like that. That we can do. So this is one devotional type of karma yoga. Then we have the Sankhya ideal that really, if we analyze, it's the mind and the intellect, the senses all working together, giving direction to the hands, that I'm simply watching the whole thing. This type of jnana yoga, you can say. So I feel that I'm not the agent, not that God is working through me, but nature itself is doing it. So this is the second type of karma yoga. Then the other is just with his emphasis on not being attached to the fruits and doing everything with perfect concentration and doing everything with devotion to the work itself. So we have these different ways that different people can practice this karma yoga. And this is, as I say, a common theme throughout the Gita, that there'll be something for everybody, all different ways that we can utilize all of these different teachings. Now, I mentioned before about the two-tiered theory. First, karma yoga, then jnana yoga, and then in Gita that we find through karma alone one can realize the highest. This doesn't mean that this kind of two-tiered theory isn't there in Gita there, because it's there also. So just two different ways of looking at the whole thing. Those who practice, say, Janaka or something, even Sri Ramakrishna used to say, but how many austerities he practiced also before that. But in general, we have this idea in Gita also that there are two levels that we reach. One, yoga rudha. There's someone who has reached that first level. In order to get that, karma. Once they've reached that, then shama. Then they have to start reducing all of their activities until the mind becomes perfectly pure and calm and everything, and then they can have that type of realization. This is very similar to how Sri Ramakrishna explains through this illustration, explains this gradual giving up of duties. When he talks about the daughter-in-law who gets pregnant, and month by month her mother-in-law will reduce her duties until the time of birth she has nothing to do, and then the baby's born only to look after the baby for some time. So we do find that. We find so many different things in Gita, different ways of looking at it through karma alone, yes, but there will come a time when we'll feel this need to give up, to renounce everything. So then we come to, finally, this, what I will say is really the final message of the Gita. Now, what is the main emphasis throughout all of the teachings in the Gita, from the very beginning to the end? We get pounded with this idea of dharma, of duty, that we have to perform our duty, and through proper performance of duty, we can even realize the highest goal, that it has to be done in the proper spirit, without any type of attachment. But performance of duty, it can't be given up. And even when it comes to which is better, to renounce duty or to perform duty, then Sri Krishna will say performance is better for most people, until we reach that point when we can give up. Now, the reason why I'm emphasizing this so much is that when we get to that final teaching, Sarva Dharman Parityajya, so give up all of this and take refuge in me. He's telling Arjuna that I've been telling you for the past, how long did it take? An hour or something that you have to perform your duty. Now he's saying give it up. Now, does that mean that he's saying now you don't have to fight in the battle? No, of course not. But it means that a time will come when we have to transcend this idea of something has to be done. This idea of duty is a very restrictive idea. So we have this side by side, this belief that performance of duty is the highest ideal for us. And at the same time, Swamiji talks about this midday scorching sun of duty, that it feels that we're bound to do something, and we want to feel that I'm free, that I have nothing that I have to do. Of course, this is a very high state to give it up. But Sri Krishna, he's giving this teaching of the Gita not just to get Arjuna to fight, but for everybody. This is universal teaching, that time will come when we have to just say, no, that now I just have to practice this sharanagati, that I take shelter. And dharma, this means strict adherence to all of these duties and things that we have to do. Dharma we give up anyhow. We don't want to do anything that is not helpful to other people. But this idea that we're bound to act, then is a very restrictive type of thing. We want to get rid of that. And even Sri Krishna says with himself, I have nothing that I have to do, but still I act. So the idea is that Arjuna, if he has this idea, still he can do it freely, understanding that this is something for the welfare of humanity, something like that. But he says, take refuge in me. Don't feel this, because the idea of duty goes back to the self, this ego sense. I have to do it. That idea. So go beyond that a little bit. And he says, I'll take care of anything bad that happens. All of your pop, don't worry about any of that. So don't worry that everything's... So we get to the, as I say, leading us through this path of duty to this final stage of sharanagati, renouncing everything, surrendering everything, that this will really be that ultimate final message of the Gita, which doesn't negate anything before it. There's a logic to it, how it leads us step by step to that, but how ultimately this great text on dharma will conclude with this great teaching of go beyond this idea of dharma and adharma and take refuge, renounce everything, and feel that we're lying in the lap of God. God will take care of us. So anyhow, I wanted to say a few words about Sri Krishna and the teachings of Gita, because this is this Thursday, one of the very special days in the tradition when we observe the birth of Sri Krishna. So let's sit for a few minutes and reflect on these things.